Ever wonder why some apps crash and burn while others seem to just magically work? The secret usually lies in the part that you can't see. That's right, it's the matrixy looking part. In the next few minutes, you'll discover what that hidden engine is that's powering your app or product, why ignoring it could cost you tons of time and money, and 3 ways how you can make smart decisions about this even as a non-technical founder. I've spent 15 years in tech and share practical tips and strategies to help founders build products that people love. So let's get started. So what is this invisible half? Well, there are 2 parts to pretty much any technology that you're using, a front end and a back end. The front end is the part that you interact with. This can be a website, it can be a dashboard, it can be an app. Even if you're using a SaaS or like some kind of service that you don't usually interact with, there is some type of portal that you log into where you can change some settings, some billing, etc. That is all considered a front end. The back end is the part that lives on a server somewhere. It's connected to the internet and it does calculations, it's trying to work things out, it stores your data. Really, it's a bit like the brain of the app. A good example of this is Google Maps. So you might put in your location and the cool new coffee shop that you want to try. That information gets sent to a server somewhere, and then the back end is calculating what the right route is for you to take. It then sends this route back to you and you can see exactly how to get there. In this case, every time that you're entering your location or you're viewing some of those driving instructions, that's all stuff that you're doing on the front end. Every time it's calculating things or live updating traffic, etc., all of that gets done on the back end. It's a little bit like your house. Every time you power on a light switch or you open the tap and water comes out, you expect everything to work, but it's you interacting with your house that's causing these things to happen. And so the inside of your house is a bit like a front end. The back end is all the foundation and all the structure that usually you can't see and usually you don't even really think about. But obviously without plumbing, without the right electricity, without all the right wiring and foundation, your house wouldn't actually function. If you were to open a tap, nothing would happen. And it's the exact same case when you're building a tech product, whether that's an app, a website, a SaaS, a dashboard, a portal, it doesn't matter. You need to be thinking about your front end and your back end. Why is that so important? Well, it affects everything about your product. It affects who you're going to hire, how much your product is going to cost, how long it's going to take, because really, depending on what you need your product to do, you want to be making certain choices when it comes to your front end and when it comes to your back end. Using that house analogy again, if you know you want to have speakers in every single room of the house, that needs to be taken into account when the wiring of the ceiling and electricity is done. Ideally. You can always change things as you go, and it's the same with your front end and your back end, but obviously it's easier to do things as they are being built. The most important thing it influences is who you're going to hire or who you're going to get to work on your product. So they're typically speaking people who specialize in front end development and back end development. If you've been looking at jobs or talking to agencies and so on, you will have seen these terms pop up. Now, why is that distinguishment important? Typically speaking, there are different programming languages and frameworks used on front end and back end. These are not just the same. Just like when you visit Europe, you can't just speak one language that's European. Instead, there is French, German, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, English, you name it. It's the same when it comes to front ends and back ends. On the front end, you can expect to see things like JavaScript, HTML and CSS, even though they're technically not a language, but they are definitely a technology, and frameworks like React, Vue, Tailwind, and many more. On the back end, you have lots of choices. Firstly, where are you hosting the back end? It could be Azure, AWS, you could be using Firebase or any other setup. And then those in turn also determine what kind of languages you can program in and what kind of programs can be executed. So you could use Ruby, C#, again, JavaScript, TypeScript, all kinds of different things. There's various frameworks as well, like Ruby on Rails or Django, and for those you need to use the corresponding language. Ruby on Rails only works with Ruby, Django only works with Python, and also depending on your goals, there are different languages that suit that better. For example, Python is really good at data analysis or data science. Now, while you may or may not be making these choices, either way, they are going to absolutely influence who you work with. And in turn, if you just hire any engineer, they will then make these decisions for you, which will cause loads of ramifications down the line. Some obviously positive, your product is being built, some potentially negative. So you might then be thinking to yourself, well, can't I get just one person who can do it all, one ring to rule them all? Well, unfortunately, it's quite tricky. If you paid attention to me listing all the different names and frameworks earlier, you saw one that overlapped on both sides, JavaScript. And with the introduction of more JavaScript frameworks, it's become very popular for folks to specialize in full-stack software. A full-stack developer is someone who can write both front-end and back-end code. And sometimes they even mix and match different languages because, yes, folks can absolutely be proficient in more than one. However, the more you add on and the more you stack on, the harder it is to find people who are truly good at that. I have a whole video on the myth of full-stack engineering over here to help you make a decision on whether or not hiring a full-stack engineer is the right choice for you. What I will say is, if you are looking to deploy on a specific platform, like for example, an app is still considered a front end because it's something that people interact with. However, they need even more specialized technology. iOS apps can only be written in Swift or Objective-C, Android apps only use Java or Kotlin, and even though nowadays we have really cool technology like React Native that kind of works on both, you still need folks who are specialized in deploying and maintaining. These are some big decisions. When should you start thinking about them? It's fairly early in the product development, but that does not mean it's something you start thinking about at the start. Instead, you want to do your product validation first because you need to have a really clear idea on what the product needs to do, what features your users need most, what people are expecting, and what you want to build before you start making these decisions. And chances are, because startup founders typically take about 2 to 3 times longer than expected to validate their product, that you can do more user interviews and more research upfront in order to make sure that these decisions will not impact your product down the road. The other time to be thinking about this is during hiring. Every time you're hiring new folks, it makes sense to go back to the drawing board and see, okay, who do we need? Where are our efforts balanced? Do we need more folks on front end? Do we need more folks on back end? And therefore, you're thinking about all of this all over again. When it comes to your first hire, it's especially important because it's likely you're going to be making these decisions together. Even if you're a non-technical founder, you absolutely want to get involved in some of these technical decision making that the people that you work with are going to do because it influences many things down the road, some of which I'll explain in just a minute. But the big thing to keep in mind is that when you're creating a job ad, you want to make sure you're listing whether it's for a front-end or a back-end developer, what the expected languages or frameworks are that you're looking to work with. If you're hiring an agency, you want to ask them, well, how is the breakdown of the team that's going to work on this? How many front-end, how many back-end engineers? What technical choices are they making? What languages is going to be written in? Because what you'll often see as well is that people use what they're familiar with. For example, if you're a pianist and you want to play an Ed Sheeran song, you're probably going to play it on the piano instead of picking up a guitar because that's what you're familiar expressing yourself in. So how do you consider these things? How do you factor this into your product development and make some clever choices? Really, there's 3 ways. Firstly, consider your app's needs. Are there mobile components, or does it only run on a website? Does it need to be mobile responsive, or is this a massive dashboard that is used in a B2B setting where no one's actually ever going to look at it on their phone? Is it the case that you have regulatory requirements? For example, sometimes in order to be HIPAA compliant or to work in certain legal industries, you need to be on a particular software stack. It could be that you need to use Azure as your backend or AWS or something else. It could also be that you have credits. You have gotten some AWS credits, you've gotten some Azure credits, which that's how they suck you in. You end up really choosing a tech stack one over the other, and once you've built it there, it's very hard to move. So think about all of the requirements that you have from a product standpoint of view, take them to your team that you're working with, and then have a good discussion about, okay, what technical choices do we have available to us and which ones are we going to now choose? The other thing to consider is your budget, because different skill sets have different hourly rates and different day rates. For example, it's slightly cheaper to find a front-end JavaScript developer than it is to find a certain type of back-end developer that specializes in a really niche section of AWS. Even when you're comparing things like for like, just a different language can already cause a change in price. I've had clients who've had folks who've written their back-end in PHP, a fairly older language. It's still used, but it's a more specialized and technical skill set, I would say. And so it's a bit harder sometimes to find folks compared to getting a JavaScript backend engineer or even Ruby or some of the others. The impact of that is twofold. Firstly, it's harder to find those people, and so swapping someone out is really challenging. And secondly, it's then also more expensive because there's more demand than there is supply. And this point of hireability is actually the third thing that you need to consider. These technologies really impact who you can hire down the line. And so if someone's suggesting for you to use a particular front-end technology or a particular back-end technology, have a look on the popular career websites to see how many job openings there are for each technology, which are kind of more popular and more easier to hire or to staff nowadays than others. Because at some point you might move away from the people you're working with, especially if you're early on and you're getting an agency to do it or a couple of contractors that are really meant to just work on this for a few months to get the product out there. When you want to make updates or even just basic maintenance in the future, you want to be able to find new people fairly easily. If your product turns out to be using outdated frameworks, APIs, and technology, it'll be much harder for folks to jump right in and find information. The other way this can impact things is in terms of Googleability. This sounds silly, but hear me out. Again, more popular technologies have many more articles online that folks can use to figure out problems and issues. Because even though programmers can be very experienced, oftentimes we just get better at understanding a problem, figuring out how to solve it, and repeating that so many times a day. Really, it's non-stop problem solving and firefighting. And one of the biggest tools at our disposal is existing documentation and existing tutorials and articles of folks who've run into very similar issues. If you're using a very obscure technology, and you may not have to use said obscure technology, it becomes much easier for the developers to problem solve. That means less time wasted for you and a product that actually delivers on time and on budget. If you are using really niche or forgotten about frameworks that are much harder to debug for folks, it's going to start creeping into your hours. Sometimes you might need to use those technologies, but if you don't, I would really recommend against it. At the end of the day, if you are creating a simple project and you don't need tons of bells and whistles, what I would really recommend is a React frontend, so that's JavaScript using a React framework, and something like a Fire-based backend. For mobile, it gets a little trickier, but there are things like Flutter and like React Native that can help. But here's another video that goes into all the details that you need to consider when you're thinking about making a mobile app. That said, leave a comment down below on your tech setup and I'll try and do a video on that in the future.